Welcome back. Tonight, we journey into the deepest reaches of galactic memory, to a time before humanity knew the stars, before the Covenant rose to power, and before the Master Chief ever walked a battlefield. This is the story of the Forerunners, the ancient architects, whose legacy shaped the destiny of every sentient being in the galaxy. Their civilization spanned millions of years, encompassing technological marvels beyond modern comprehension, philosophical depths that challenged the nature of existence itself, and ultimately, a tragedy so profound that it nearly extinguished all life in the Milky Way. This chronicle begins approximately 10 million years before the present day, in an era when the galaxy sang with possibilities yet unimagined. Settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let the weight of countless millennia wash over you as we explore the complete ancient history of the Forerunners. Chapter 1: Before the Beginning, the Precursor Legacy. To understand the Forerunners, we must first understand those who came before. The precursors were beings so ancient and so utterly beyond ordinary comprehension that even the Forerunners, at the height of their power, struggled to classify them. They designated the precursors as Tier 0 on their technological achievement scale, a classification reserved for theoretical transcendent entities, beings whose capabilities transcended normal physical and conceptual limitations. The precursors did not originate from the Milky Way galaxy. They came from somewhere beyond, from regions of space and perhaps dimensions that remain unknown to this day. When they arrived in our galaxy billions of years ago, they brought with them technologies and philosophies that would leave permanent marks upon the fabric of reality itself. These were not conquerors in any traditional sense. The precursors saw themselves as gardeners, cultivators of life across multiple galaxies, experimenters on a cosmic scale whose experiments spanned geological epochs. The foundation of all precursor technology was a concept they called neural physics. This was not merely technology in the way younger races understood it, not simply the application of scientific principles to create tools and machines. Neural physics was a fundamental philosophy that blurred the boundary between belief and science, between the physical and the metaphysical. The precursors believed and demonstrated that the mantle of responsibility, their guiding principle, extended not merely to living beings, but to the entire universe. Energy and matter, in their understanding, were as much part of the living cosmos as any biological organism. According to this philosophy, the universe itself was alive, not alive in the way organic beings understand life, with consciousness and will and desire, but alive in some transcendent manner that biological mind simply cannot fully grasp. The precursors existed on a level beyond conventional sapience. They were described as dreamers and makers whose minds transcended many realms, possessing infinite forms, many voices, and singular purpose. They were not bound to any particular physical form. They could assume any shape they desired, and indeed, they allowed themselves to die and be evolved anew over and over again, taking on countless incarnations, both physical and immaterial, across their incomprehensibly long existence. Drawing from exotic neurophysical energies that permeated the cosmos, the precursors constructed artifacts that were, for all practical purposes, eternal. These structures were not made of ordinary matter. Instead, They were composed through neural physics, which rendered them effectively indestructible through conventional means. They could survive for millions, potentially billions of years without any sign of decay. When forerunner miners and explorers, millions of years later, would stumble across these ancient constructs, they found them still functioning, still perfect, despite having endured unimaginable spans of time. The most impressive of these precursor constructs were the star roads, also called the unbending filaments. These were enormous cables, several kilometers thick, that lay across the galaxy for millions of years. They served multiple purposes. On smaller scales, they formed orbital and suborbital structures around individual worlds, creating arches and bridges between locations. On grander scales, they connected entire planets and solar systems to one another, creating a physical network spanning interstellar distances. These star roads were not static structures. Being composed of neural physics construction, they could change their mass and shape at will, responding to needs and purposes that only the precursors understood. The precursors also created what came to be known as the domain, though they called it the organon. This was a transcendent quantum reservoir of information, a web containing billions of years of precursor knowledge and experience. The domain was more than a mere database or library. It was, in its own way, a conscious entity, though this aspect of its nature would not become apparent, even to the forerunners, until near the very end of their civilization. The domain represented the collective memory and wisdom of the precursor race, preserved in a form that could theoretically endure forever. Other precursor technologies included planetary fortresses, citadels of impossible scale and power, knowledge engines that served as incredibly advanced artificial intelligence constructs aboard their vessels, and stasis capsules capable of preserving beings across vast spans of time. They possessed the capability to engineer entire planets, to construct artificial worlds through means the forerunners would never fully understand. They could travel between galaxies using superluminal transit mechanisms based on neural physics, methods that bypass the limitations of conventional slipspace travel. Perhaps most significantly, the precursors seeded the Milky Way with life. They created the galaxy's diverse composition of species, experimenting across countless worlds and countless generations. Their stewardship for all life was rooted in the belief that all experiences of biological organisms enriched the greater universal whole, something they experienced firsthand through the constantly changing nature of their own existence. They were not strictly benevolent in the way younger races might understand benevolence. The precursors recognized that strife, pain, and even evil were inherent parts of the universe. The struggles between good and evil, the pleasures and pains of life, all of these added to something they called the sweetness, a sensation or emotional state that had no true analog in human or even forerunner understanding. Over immeasurable time, the precursors evaluated the species they had created, testing them, judging their worthiness to inherit responsibility for the galaxy. Many races were deemed unsuitable after testing and were either eradicated or simply abandoned by their creators, left to develop or decline on their own. But among all the species the precursors cultivated, 3 would prove to be of particular significance in the ages to come. The first of these were the Sanshayum, who would one day be known to humanity as the prophets. The second were the forerunners themselves, engineered to be a race of supreme technological capability and organizational prowess. And the third were the humans, or as the Forerunners would come to call them, the ancients, a species that showed remarkable humility and responsibility, despite their comparatively primitive development. Around 10 million years before the Common Era, the precursors faced a momentous decision. They had decided that the time had come to pass on the mantle of responsibility, the sacred duty of protecting and shepherding all life in the galaxy. In their inscrutable wisdom, they chose humanity to be the inheritors of this sacred charge, not the Forerunners, despite their obvious technological superiority and organizational sophistication. The precursors looked beyond mere technological achievement. They valued humility, responsibility, and a certain quality of wisdom that humanity, still in its relative infancy, nevertheless possessed. This decision would prove to be the catalyst for the greatest catastrophe in galactic history. Chapter 2: The Forerunner Rebellion and the War of the Ancients. The Forerunners were, by the time of the Precursors' decision, already an advanced and powerful civilization. They had spread across significant portions of the galaxy, establishing what they called the ecumene, a vast domain of approximately 3 million fertile worlds united under their rule. They had organized their society into a complex caste system called rates, with each rate specializing in particular fields and serving specific functions within their civilization. At the apex of Forerunner society were the builders, architects, and engineers responsible for the great works that defined their civilization. Below them were the miners who gathered the raw materials the builders required and who engaged in stellar and planetary engineering on massive scales. The life workers specialized in biology, medicine, and the study and preservation of life in all its forms. The warrior servants, despite their crucial role in defending the ecumene, were ranked surprisingly low in the social hierarchy, a fact that reflected the Forerunners' self-image as a peaceful people who resorted to violence only when absolutely necessary. The juridicals served as judges and investigators of crimes, particularly those relating to violations of the mantle. And there were other, smaller rates, each with their specific purposes and traditions. Forerunner society was rigid and hierarchical, governed by an ecumene council where representatives of the various rates debated policy and made decisions affecting their entire civilization. Young Forerunners were called manipulars, and they were not associated with any particular rate during their adolescence. Upon reaching maturity, each individual would be assigned to a rate, usually the same rate as their parents, though exceptions existed. Through genetic engineering and biochemical manipulation, Forerunners of each rate were given distinctive physical characteristics suited to their role in society. Promotions and advancements in rank were often accompanied by physical mutations, visible signs of an individual's status and accomplishments. The Forerunners believed they were the rightful holders of the mantle of responsibility. For countless generations, they had dedicated themselves to the protection and cultivation of life throughout the galaxy. They had watched over developing species, carefully guiding evolution, ensuring that no major catastrophes befell the younger races under their care. In their view, they had earned the mantle through diligent service and demonstrated competence. The idea that the precursors, their own creators, might pass this sacred duty to another species, particularly one as young and primitive as humanity, was incomprehensible to them. When the precursors made their decision known, the forerunners faced an existential crisis. Everything they had believed about their place in the cosmos, everything that gave their civilization meaning and purpose, was suddenly called into question. How could the precursors choose humanity? What did those primitive creatures possess that the forerunners lacked? The decision seemed not merely unjust, but fundamentally irrational. Faced with what they perceived as the ultimate injustice, the forerunner leadership made a fateful choice. They would not accept this judgment. They would not surrender the mantle to humanity or to anyone else. If the precursors would not willingly grant them what was rightfully theirs, then the forerunners would take it by force. They would rebel against their own creators. At that time, approximately 10 million years before the Common Era, the warrior servants were the highest rate in forerunner society, not yet diminished by the rise of builder political power. It was they who bore the responsibility for this terrible decision. And it was they who planned and executed the largest military campaign the forerunners had ever mounted. They assembled fleets and armies on a scale never before seen, preparing to strike against beings they had once revered as gods. The attack took the precursors completely by surprise. Despite their vast superiority in technology and capability, they had not expected their own creations to turn against them with such violence. They did not mount a proper defense. According to later records, they seemed almost to marvel at the sheer violence the forerunners were capable of, as if observing an unexpected but fascinating development in one of their experiments. They did not retaliate, did not bring their full power to bear against the rebels. Instead, they simply retreated, attempting to withdraw from the Milky Way. The forerunners pursued them relentlessly. What followed was not truly a war in the traditional sense, but rather a one-sided slaughter. The forerunners drove the precursors before them, hunting them down with merciless efficiency. Only a fraction of the warrior servant forces that departed on this campaign ever returned, and those who did brought with them weapons, technologies, and knowledge stolen from the precursors they had killed. For millennia, the true outcome of this conflict was kept a carefully guarded secret, known only to the highest levels of forerunner leadership. The forerunners believed they had successfully eradicated the precursors, driving them to extinction and securing the mantle for themselves. But they were wrong. The precursors were not so easily destroyed. Some survived, scattered and diminished, but not entirely gone, and in their survival lay the seeds of a revenge so terrible that it would nearly destroy all life in the galaxy. One surviving precursor, later known as the primordial or the last precursor, was discovered millions of years later by ancient humanity. The humans found this entity in a state of deep hibernation on a small moon in a distant arm of the Milky Way, encased in a stasis capsule of precursor design. Not understanding what they had found, not recognizing the danger it represented, they brought it back to their territories for study. The primordial had survived by allowing itself to mutate over the vast passage of time, transforming into something that bore little resemblance to the precursors of old. Its appearance was monstrous, alien even by precursor standards, a being of tentacles and impossible geometry that inspired dread in all who beheld it. But More dangerous than its physical form was its intellect and its purpose. The primordial had not forgotten the Forerunner's betrayal. It had spent millions of years in silent contemplation, nursing its hatred, refining its plans for revenge. And it understood something the Forerunners did not. The precursors had once experimented with many forms of existence, trying countless approaches to their role as gardeners of the galaxy. One of those experiments had involved reducing themselves to the most basic organic components, effectively transforming themselves into a powder, a dust that retained their sentience and knowledge in dormant form. This precursor dust would eventually become the foundation for the Flood, though that catastrophe still lay far in the future. For now, in the aftermath of the Forerunner Rebellion, the galaxy entered an age of apparent peace. The Forerunners consolidated their hold on the mantle, believing they had secured their rightful place as the caretakers of all life. They did not know that one day their very existence would be called into question by the horrible consequences of their ancient crime. Chapter 3. The Rise of the Ecumene. With the precursors gone, and no apparent rivals to their dominance, the Forerunners entered what would be the longest sustained period of civilization in galactic history. For approximately 9 million years, give or take several 100,000, they reigned as the undisputed masters of the Milky Way. Their ecumene grew to encompass 3 million fertile worlds, billions upon billions of citizens, and technological capabilities that approached the theoretical limits of what was possible within the known laws of physics. The centerpiece of their empire was the capital, an immense artificial world of breathtaking majesty. The Forerunners called it Maethrilion, and it served as the seat of their government and the home of the Ecumene Council. Maethrilion was not merely a planet, but a work of art on a planetary scale, a testament to the supreme capabilities of the builder rate. Its surfaces were covered in structures of impossible beauty, towers that reached into the upper atmosphere, gardens that spanned entire continents, technological installations that hummed with power sufficient to reshape reality itself on local scales. At the heart of every Forerunner's existence, both literally and metaphorically, was the domain. What the Forerunners did not know, what they would not discover until it was far too late, was that the domain was not their creation. It was precursor technology, one of the few remnants of that ancient race's presence in the galaxy. The Forerunners had discovered it, had learned to access it, and over countless generations had filled it with their own records, their own knowledge, their own culture. But they never truly understood its nature or its origin. To them, it remained a mystery, the one they had integrated so thoroughly into their society that they could scarcely imagine existence without it. The domain was described as a vast immaterial database where all history, knowledge, and even life experiences could be stored. When a Forerunner died, their consciousness could be preserved in the domain, allowing them to communicate with the living and to share the wisdom accumulated over their lifetime. It was simultaneously a library, a communications network, a cultural repository, and something akin to a collective unconscious for the entire Forerunner race. The greatest minds of every generation contributed to it, ensuring that knowledge was never truly lost, that the hard-won insights of brilliant scientists and philosophers would be available to guide future generations. Forerunner culture during this long age of dominance was characterized by a profound sense of responsibility, tempered with an equally profound sense of superiority. They truly believed in the mantle, in their duty to protect and guide all life in the galaxy. But they also believed, with absolute certainty, that they were the only species capable of bearing this responsibility. They looked upon other races with a mixture of benevolent paternalism and barely concealed disdain. To be a forerunner was to be inherently superior, inherently more worthy than any other form of life. This attitude extended even to their own offspring. Young manipulators were subjected to rigorous education and testing, evaluated constantly for their potential contributions to forerunner society. Those who showed exceptional promise in particular fields were guided toward the appropriate rate. Those who failed to meet expectations were relegated to lesser positions, sometimes even subjected to genetic modifications that effectively locked them into lower social strata. The forerunner concept of equality did not extend beyond their own species, and even within their own kind, the rate system ensured that not all forerunners were truly equal. The builder rate, during most of this long epoch, wielded the greatest political power. They controlled the means of production, the great factories and construction facilities that created everything from humble tools to massive warships and installations. The most powerful builder bore the title of master builder, and this individual effectively controlled the economic engine that drove the entire ecumene. The master builder's political influence often rivaled or exceeded that of the ecumene council itself, a situation that would prove problematic in the wars to come. The life workers, despite the apparent centrality of their work to the principles of the mantle, ranked surprisingly low in the social hierarchy. They were placed above warrior servants, but below miners, a paradox that reflected the contradictions inherent in forerunner philosophy. They claimed to value all life above all else, yet those responsible for studying and protecting that life were not granted commensurate status. This would create tensions that simmered beneath the surface of forerunner society for millions of years. The warrior servants occupied a particularly uncomfortable position. Their skills were vital to the maintenance of the ecumene, as there were always threats to be confronted, always rebellious species to be subdued, always dangers lurking at the edges of known space. Yet, their very existence seemed to contradict the forerunners' self-image as peaceful guardians. Most forerunners looked down upon the warrior servants, viewing their work as distasteful, even while acknowledging its necessity. The warriors, for their part, tended to keep to themselves, developing their own subculture with its own values and traditions. The most elite of the warrior servants were the Prometheans, a title reserved for the greatest military minds and most skilled combatants in Forerunner history. To achieve the rank of Promethean was to be recognized as the absolute pinnacle of martial excellence. These were not mere soldiers, but strategic geniuses, individuals capable of conducting campaigns spanning entire sectors of the galaxy, able to coordinate the movements of fleets and armies with precision that bordered on precognition. The title of Protector of the Ecumene was held by the Supreme Commander of all warrior servant forces, effectively making them the military leader of the entire Forerunner civilization. For millions of years, this system worked. The ecumene expanded steadily, but not explosively, bringing new worlds into the fold through a combination of colonization and peaceful absorption of less advanced species. The Forerunners established monitoring stations throughout the galaxy, keeping watch over developing civilizations, carefully intervening when necessary to prevent catastrophic outcomes. They believed they were fulfilling their sacred duty, shepherding the galaxy toward some undefined but surely glorious future. But even during this long age of stability, there were warning signs that careful observers might have noticed. Periodically, Forerunner expeditions would stumble across ancient precursor artifacts, structures that had survived millions of years without maintenance. These discoveries were typically turned over to the miners who recorded them but rarely showed much interest beyond their potential as sources of exotic materials. No one seemed to wonder why these artifacts existed, why they had been built, or what their presence might signify about the true history of the galaxy. And at the very edges of explored space, strange reports occasionally filtered back to the capital. Entire monitoring outposts would go silent without explanation. Ships would disappear, leaving no trace of what had happened to them. Expeditions to investigate these disappearances would sometimes find nothing, and sometimes find something worse than nothing. Entire worlds stripped of life, reduced to barren rocks orbiting cold stars. These incidents were rare enough, and far enough from the core worlds of the ecumene, that they were generally dismissed as unfortunate accidents or the actions of some unknown but presumably minor threat. No one recognized these warning signs for what they were. No one understood that another species, one that the Forerunners had considered long extinct, was developing in the outer reaches of the galaxy, growing strong, building their own civilization. The ancient humans, the species the precursors had chosen to inherit the mantle, were rising, and with their rise would come the first true test of the Forerunner claim to galactic supremacy. Chapter 4: Ancient Humanity and the Human Forerunner Wars. The humans that existed approximately 100,000 years before the modern era bore little resemblance to the species that would one day produce heroes like the Master Chief. Ancient humanity had evolved on Earth, which the Forerunners called Ere de Terrene, developing intelligence and eventually technology without any apparent Forerunner intervention or even knowledge. By the time the Forerunners became aware of them as a significant presence in the galaxy, humanity had already established a far-flung empire of their own, competing with the Forerunners for territory and resources. Ancient humanity had also formed an alliance with another species, the Sanshayum, the same race that the precursors had cultivated alongside the Forerunners and humans. Together, these two species created a joint civilization centered on a world called Charum Hakor, a planet that would prove to be far more significant than anyone suspected. This human-Sanshayum alliance was formidable, possessing advanced technology that, while not quite equal to that of the Forerunners, was nonetheless sufficient to pose a genuine threat to ecumene interests. The relationship between ancient humanity and the Forerunners was complex and, for most of their shared history, characterized by mutual suspicion and occasional conflict over border territories. But it was not yet outright war. Both civilizations were expansionist by nature, but the galaxy was vast enough that they could largely avoid each other when they chose to do so. This uneasy coexistence might have continued indefinitely if not for the emergence of a threat that neither species had anticipated. Around 107,445 BCE, approximately 10,000 years before the final cataclysm that would reshape the galaxy, humanity encountered something that would change everything. On several of their outer colony worlds, settlers began discovering canisters, ancient containers made of glass or crystal, each holding a fine powder of unusual composition. The origin of these canisters was unknown, and initially, humans paid them little attention. Some enterprising souls discovered that when this powder was given to domesticated animals, it seemed to improve their behavior, making them more docile and obedient. What humanity did not realize, could not have realized, was that this powder was the desiccated remains of the precursors. Millions of years ago, when the forerunners had nearly exterminated them, some precursors had chosen to transform themselves into this dormant state, hoping to survive until conditions were more favorable. But something had gone wrong during those millions of years of dormancy. The powder had corrupted, had become twisted and malevolent, retaining the precursors' vast intelligence, but losing whatever benevolence they might once have possessed. The powder was not improving the behavior of animals. It was infecting them, altering them on a genetic level, turning them into something new and terrible. And it was only waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. When that moment came, the domesticated pets that had been fed the powder turned on their owners with horrifying violence. They infected other animals, which infected more, and the infection spread with terrifying speed. Those infected began to mutate, their bodies reshaping themselves in grotesque ways, their minds subsumed into a growing collective intelligence. This was the birth of the flood. The first flood outbreak caught ancient humanity completely by surprise. One day, their worlds were peaceful and prosperous. The next, they were fighting for their very survival against a plague that seemed unstoppable. The flood consumed entire planets in days, transforming all biological matter into more of itself, growing exponentially with each world it touched. Ancient humanity mobilized every resource at their disposal, but the parasite adapted to every weapon, every strategy they devised. For every world they managed to save, 3 more fell to the infection. Desperate to escape this nightmare, humanity began expanding aggressively into neighboring territory. They had no choice. The flood was pushing them inward, consuming their outer colonies one after another. If they did not expand, they would be trapped, surrounded, inevitably consumed. And the territory they expanded into was claimed by the forerunners. From the forerunner perspective, what they saw was an unprovoked invasion. Human fleets appeared without warning, attacking forerunner worlds, seizing them through overwhelming force, and most disturbingly, destroying any world they could not hold. The humans seemed to be engaging in wanton destruction, glassing planets from orbit, rendering them uninhabitable, creating a trail of devastated worlds in their wake. The forerunners had no knowledge of the flood at this time. To them, humanity had simply decided to wage a war of conquest and extinction against the ecumene. The forerunner response was swift and overwhelming. They marshaled their vast military forces, bringing the full might of the warrior servant rate to bear against what they perceived as human aggression. Leading these forces was one of the greatest military minds in Forerunner history, a Promethean named shadow of sundered star, though he would become known to history by his title, the Didact. The Didact was a complex figure, brilliant and dedicated, but also scarred by personal tragedy and driven by a fierce pride. He had been born into controversy. His parents had been part of a movement seeking to restore rates that had been lost to forerunner culture, rates whose knowledge and traditions had been deliberately suppressed by the builders to maintain their own power. This movement had sparked a conflict called the Cradle Conflicts, and the Didact's parents had been executed for their role in it. The young Didact, then barely more than a manipular, had his memories erased as part of his punishment, leaving him with only fragmented knowledge of his true identity and heritage. Despite this traumatic beginning, or perhaps because of it, the Didact had risen to the very pinnacle of warrior servant society. He believed absolutely in the mantle of responsibility and in the forerunner's duty to uphold it. He also believed that the only way to properly defend the mantle was through strength, through military power wielded with precision and overwhelming force when necessary. In his view, what humanity was doing, attacking forerunner worlds and destroying them, was the ultimate violation of the mantle, an attack not just on the forerunners, but on life itself. The Didact's campaigns against humanity were brutally effective. He drove human forces back system by system, world by world, employing strategies that maximized forerunner advantages in technology and coordination while minimizing casualties. But even as he won battle after battle, even as he pushed humanity back toward their core worlds, he began to sense that something was not quite right about this war. The humans fought with desperate ferocity, as if they were not waging a war of conquest, but fighting for their very survival. And the worlds they destroyed, they did so reluctantly, evacuating as much of the population as they could before unleashing the firestorm. This was not the behavior of conquerors. This was the behavior of the desperate. Humanity was led during this crisis by a human lord of admirals named Forthencho, a tactical genius who managed to coordinate military forces across thousands of light years, despite the overwhelming pressure of fighting on two fronts. Forthencho recognized that humanity could not win against both the Forerunners and the Flood. He chose to focus primarily on containing the parasite, even if it meant sacrificing ground to the Forerunners. His strategy was to create a firebreak, deliberately destroying uninfected worlds in the Flood's path to deny it resources and hopefully stop its advance. This strategy was ethically dubious at best and monstrously wasteful at worst. It also inevitably meant that human forces would destroy Forerunner worlds, leading the Forerunners to marshal ever greater forces against humanity. Forthencho hoped that humanity might develop a cure for the Flood before they were completely crushed between these two existential threats. But time was running out, and the Forerunners showed no signs of slowing their advance. The war ground on for approximately 1,000 years. It was a war unlike any the galaxy had seen since the Forerunner rebellion against the Precursors. Entire fleets clashed in the void, worlds burned, trillions died, and gradually, inevitably, humanity was pushed back. Their territories shrank, their colonies fell, one by one. The San Shayum, who had been humanity's allies throughout this long nightmare, began to waver. They opened secret negotiations with the Forerunners, seeking terms that would allow them to survive, even if humanity did not. The final battle of the war took place at Charum Hakor, humanity's last stronghold. The siege lasted 3 years, with Forthencho and the remnants of his forces holding out against everything the Didact could throw at them. Charum Hakor proved to be nearly impregnable, defended by technology that the Forerunners could not understand and could barely overcome. The planet was, unbeknownst to the Forerunners, a precursor hub world constructed millions of years earlier using neural physics. Its defenses included massive orbital structures, ancient weapons of immense power, and the ability to manipulate space-time in ways that made conventional assault nearly impossible. But even precursor technology could not hold forever against the sustained assault of a Forerunner army. The San Shayum, seeing the inevitable outcome, made their secret deal. They agreed to surrender in exchange for being placed under Forerunner supervision rather than being destroyed outright. This betrayal undermined the last of Charum Hakor's defenses, and the Didact's forces finally breached the world's security. Forthencho, seeing that further resistance was futile, negotiated humanity's surrender. Only then did the Forerunners learn the truth about the Flood. During their interrogation of captured human commanders, including Forthencho himself, the Didact and other Forerunner leaders discovered that humanity had not been waging a war of conquest, but a desperate fight for survival. The Flood had forced them into Forerunner territory. The worlds they had destroyed to contain the parasite. And, most disturbing of all, the Flood seemed to have mysteriously vanished shortly before humanity's final defeat, retreating back into the depths of space as if it had accomplished some hidden purpose. This revelation created a profound dilemma for the Forerunners. According to the principles of the mantle, all life was precious and should be preserved when possible. Humanity had been fighting to survive, not to conquer. Their actions, while terrible, had been motivated by necessity rather than evil intent. Did they deserve extinction for this? The Ecumene Council debated for many months, and ultimately they chose a middle path. Humanity would not be exterminated, but neither would they be forgiven. Instead, they would be devolved, reduced genetically to a primitive state, stripped of all their technology and advanced knowledge. The human empire would be destroyed completely, its worlds either depopulated or repopulated with these devolved humans who would be forced to start over, evolving again from a near primitive state. The most significant human populations would be settled on their homeworld, Erde Tyrene, where they would be monitored by Forerunner life workers. Perhaps, over many thousands of years, they might evolve again to achieve sentience. Perhaps they might even redeem themselves and prove worthy of the mantle after all. But for Forthencho and many of the most prominent human leaders, something else was planned. The Forerunners had developed a technology called the Composer, a device capable of extracting the mental patterns and memories of living beings, reducing them to pure data. The Composer had been created initially as a means of achieving a form of immortality, allowing Forerunners to transfer their consciousness into new, younger bodies when their original forms became too damaged or aged. But the technology had never been perfected. Attempts to integrate composed essences back into physical bodies resulted in monstrous failures abominations that retained only fragments of their original consciousness and exhibited disturbing behaviors. Despite these failures, the forerunners saw the composer as a tool that could serve another purpose. They would compose the leaders of ancient humanity, particularly those stationed at Charum Hakor, extracting their essences and storing them for study. The forerunners hoped that by examining these essences, by sifting through the accumulated memories and knowledge of humanity's greatest minds, they might discover whether humans had developed a cure for the flood. If such a cure existed, it might save the forerunners if the parasite ever returned. The didact's wife, a life worker named the librarian, witnessed these compositions with growing horror. She was one of the few forerunners who believed that humanity had been unjustly treated, that their devolution was a violation of the very principles of the mantle. Without telling anyone, not even her husband, she secretly integrated some of these composed human essences into the genetic patterns of the devolved humans being settled on Erde Tyrene. She embedded what she called Ogias, a form of genetic command or inherited memory that might one day allow humanity to recover what they had lost and to fulfill the destiny the precursors had intended for them. The librarian could not openly oppose the council's decision, but she could work in secret to ensure that humanity had a chance at redemption. She believed that if the flood ever returned, humanity might hold the key to defeating it. And she believed, though she could not prove it and dared not speak it aloud, that the precursors' original choice of humanity as inheritors of the mantle had been correct. The human forerunner wars ended with humanity crushed, devolved, and scattered across their homeworld to slowly rebuild from near nothing. The Sanshayum were placed under strict quarantine on their homeworld, forbidden from developing advanced technology or leaving their system. And the forerunners, believing they had successfully defended the mantle and contained the threat of the flood, turned their attention back to the business of maintaining their ecumene. But the flood had not been defeated. It had merely withdrawn, biding its time, waiting for the right moment to return. And when it did return, it would bring with it forces that would push the forerunners to the very brink of extinction. Chapter 5. The Forerunner Flood War. The first stages. For several thousand years after the end of the human Forerunner Wars, the Forerunners enjoyed what appeared to be a return to normalcy. The ecumene continued to function as it always had. The various rates pursued their duties. The Ecumene Council debated policy and made decisions about the governance of their 3 million worlds. To most forerunners, the war with humanity had been an unfortunate but necessary defense of the mantle. And now that it was over, they could return to the peaceful work of shepherding the galaxy's lesser species. But a few among the Forerunner leadership knew better. They knew that the flood was real, that it represented a threat unlike anything the ecumene had ever faced, and that its mysterious withdrawal during the final years of the war with humanity suggested it might return. Foremost among these concerned leaders were the didact and the librarian. They had interrogated human prisoners extensively. They had examined the records humanity had kept of their battles against the parasite, and they had come to understand that the flood was not merely a disease or even a simple parasitic organism. It was intelligent, adaptive, and seemingly driven by a purpose that went beyond simple survival and reproduction. The didact, ever the warrior, believed that the forerunners needed to prepare for the flood's return by building defensive installations that could contain the parasite when it emerged. He proposed the creation of what he called shield worlds, massive installations that could serve as fortresses against the flood. These shield worlds would be capable of sheltering entire populations while simultaneously serving as bases from which military forces could strike at infected regions. They could be deployed to systems under attack, creating protected zones where the flood could not penetrate and from which infected regions could be systematically cleansed. The concept of the shield worlds was elegant and practical. They would be constructed using the most advanced Forerunner technology, incorporating lessons learned from the study of Charum Hakor's defenses. Each shield world would be essentially a pocket universe, accessible only through carefully controlled portals, making them nearly impossible for the flood to infiltrate. Inside, they could contain everything necessary to sustain Forerunner civilization indefinitely: food production, industrial facilities, living quarters, and military installations. But the didact's proposal faced significant opposition, particularly from the builder rate and their leader, the master builder Faber of Will and Might. Faber was a brilliant but ruthless individual who believed that the greatest threat to the Forerunners was not external, but internal, the tendency toward complacency and weakness that came from millions of years of unchallenged dominance. He argued that shield worlds, while potentially useful, were fundamentally defensive in nature. They represented a retreat and admission that the Forerunners might not be able to defeat the flood in open combat. Faber proposed instead the creation of a weapon system unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Drawing on the research the Forerunners had extracted from ancient human records, which suggested that the flood could be repelled by certain neurophysical attacks, Faber conceived of a weapon that would exploit this vulnerability on a galactic scale. He called his creation Halo. The Halo installations would be massive ring worlds, each thousands of kilometers in diameter, capable of supporting life on their inner surfaces. But their primary purpose would not be to sustain life, but to end it. Each Halo would be equipped with what Faber called a phase pulse generator, a weapon system capable of emitting a precisely calibrated burst of energy that would resonate with neural structures. This resonance would effectively destroy any sufficiently complex nervous system within range, killing all sentient life instantly and painlessly, while leaving simpler organisms and plants unharmed. The genius of the Halo array, as Faber envisioned it, lay in its comprehensive solution to the flood problem. The flood was a parasite that required hosts, sentient beings with complex nervous systems that could be infected and transformed. If all such beings were killed, the flood would be left with nothing to infect. Any flood forms that had already been created would quickly starve to death without new hosts to consume. A single Halo firing could sterilize an entire sector of space. Multiple Halos working in concert could cleanse the entire galaxy. The proposal was audacious, terrifying, and from a certain cold perspective, perfectly logical. If the flood represented an existential threat to all life in the galaxy, then temporary extinction followed by repopulation was preferable to total and permanent extinction through flood assimilation. The forerunners could prepare for such an eventuality by cataloging and preserving samples of all sentient species, storing them safely away where the halo's pulse could not reach them. After the firing, these preserved populations could be returned to their homeworlds, allowing life to continue as if the catastrophe had never occurred. The debate over which approach to take, shield worlds or halo, raged through the Ecumene Council for many years. The didact argued passionately for his defensive strategy, emphasizing that the shield worlds could be deployed quickly to threatened regions, that they represented a measured and ethical response consistent with the principles of the mantle. Faber countered that Halo was the only guaranteed solution, that shield worlds might protect some forerunners, but would doom countless other species to flood assimilation, and that failing to prepare the ultimate weapon was an abdication of the forerunners' responsibility as bearers of the mantle. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The builders would construct both the shield worlds and the halo array. The shield worlds would serve as the first line of defense, deployed to contain flood outbreaks where they occurred. But if the flood could not be contained, if it threatened to overrun the galaxy entirely, then Halo would serve as the final solution. The shield worlds would be the sword, and Halo the shield, or perhaps more accurately, Halo would be the apocalypse held in reserve, the option that would only be employed when all else had failed. To oversee this vast undertaking, the Forerunners created the most sophisticated and powerful artificial intelligence they had ever devised. They called it mendicant bias, and they designed it to possess capabilities far exceeding any ancilla that had come before. Mendicant bias would be responsible for coordinating the defense against the flood, for managing the incredible complexity of deploying shield worlds and potentially activating the Halo array, and for leading Forerunner military forces in combat against the parasite. The creation of mendicant bias and the construction of the first Halo installations took place on a remote facility of truly staggering scale. This facility, which the Forerunners called the Ark, was built far outside the galaxy proper in a region of intergalactic space where it would be safe from any catastrophe that might befall the Milky Way. The Ark served multiple purposes. It was a construction facility capable of building and maintaining the Halo installations. It was a repository where samples of all galactic life could be preserved. And it was, essentially, a seed bank for an entire galaxy, a place from which life could be restored after extinction-level events. The first Halo installations constructed at the Ark were enormous, approximately 30,000 kilometers in diameter. These original rings were marvels of engineering that pushed Forerunner capabilities to their limits. Each one was, in essence, a miniature world capable of supporting diverse ecosystems on its inner surface. The ring worlds rotated to generate artificial gravity, and their internal systems could be fine-tuned to recreate the environmental conditions of virtually any planet in the galaxy. But as construction progressed, the builders realized they had two significant problems. First, the original Halos were extremely difficult to transport due to their immense size. Moving them from the Ark to their intended positions around the galaxy would require tremendous amounts of energy and time, during which they would be vulnerable to attack or sabotage. Second, and more critically, The original firing mechanism was not as effective as required. The phase pulse generators on these first installations could only emit a linear widening burst of energy, which meant their effective range was limited and their coverage pattern inefficient. To address these issues, Faber ordered the construction of a second arc installation called the Lesser Arc, which would be dedicated to producing a new generation of halo installations. These new rings would be much smaller, approximately 10,000 kilometers in diameter, making them significantly easier to transport and deploy. More importantly, they would be equipped with improved phase pulse generators capable of emitting a spherical pulse, effectively creating a globe of destruction, radiating outward from the ring in all directions. This spherical firing pattern would give each installation a vastly greater effective range and ensure complete coverage of their assigned regions of the galaxy. While these preparations were being made, the didact and the warrior servants had not been idle. They had successfully lobbied for resources to begin construction on the shield worlds, and several were already in various stages of completion. The didact oversaw this effort personally, determined to ensure that when the flood returned, the Forerunners would have safe havens from which to mount their defense. He poured his considerable intellect and expertise into the design of these installations, making them as secure and militarily effective as possible. But the political situation within the Forerunner government was deteriorating. The builders, emboldened by their success in winning support for the Halo project, were using their economic power and influence to gradually marginalize the warrior servants. They argued that the era of large standing military forces was over, that the Forerunners' true strength lay in their technology and industry rather than in military might. The didact's opposition to Halo, his insistence on pursuing shield worlds as an alternative, made him a target for builder political maneuvering. The tension between the didact and master builder Faber grew increasingly bitter. These two powerful individuals represented fundamentally different philosophies about how to defend the mantle and what it meant to be a Forerunner. Faber believed in decisive action, in accepting whatever costs were necessary to ensure victory. The didact believed in honor, in military discipline, in meeting threats with measured force rather than apocalyptic weapons. Neither was entirely wrong, but neither could see the value in the other's perspective. This conflict would have explosive consequences. But before the political crisis could fully develop, before the didact and Faber could settle their differences one way or another, an event occurred that would accelerate everything. A young Forerunner manipular, rebellious and curious, would stumble upon a discovery that would force the Forerunners to confront truths they had spent millions of years avoiding. Chapter 6. Born Stellar Makes Eternal Lasting and the Discovery. Born Stellar Makes Eternal Lasting was, by Forerunner standards, not particularly exceptional. He was a young manipular from a prominent builder family, expected to follow in his father's footsteps and eventually join the builder rate. But Born Stellar had no interest in following the path laid out for him. He found the rituals and requirements of builder life tedious and constraining. He dreamed instead of adventure, of discovering ancient precursor artifacts and making his own mark on the galaxy, rather than simply following someone else's plans. His father, recognizing Born Stellar's stubborn refusal to conform, made a decision that was meant to be a punishment, but would prove to be anything but. He sent Bornsteller to the barren world of Edom, later known to humanity as Mars, hoping that the harsh environment and isolation would cure the young manipular of his rebellious tendencies. But Edom did nothing to diminish Bornsteller's hunger for adventure. If anything, it intensified it. When Bornsteller learned about Erde-Tyrene, the human homeworld, he saw an opportunity. Erde-Tyrene was known to have been inhabited by the ancient humans before their devolution, and where humans had lived, there might be forerunner installations, monitoring stations, or even precursor artifacts left over from the age when that race had seeded the galaxy with life. Against all regulations and without permission, Bornsteller made his way to Erde-Tyrene in approximately 100,300 BCE. On Erde-Tyrene, Bornsteller enlisted the help of two humans, a male named Chakas and a female named Riser. These humans were among the devolved descendants of the ancient empire, living as simple hunter-gatherers with no memory of their species' former glory. But they possessed an intuitive knowledge of their world that proved invaluable to Bornsteller in his search. Together, the three of them made their way to a mysterious location called Jamonkin Crater, a place the local humans regarded with superstitious awe and fear. What Bornsteller found in Jamonkin Crater was a forerunner cryptum, a stasis vessel designed to preserve its occupant across enormous spans of time. This was not merely any cryptum, however. Through markings and signals that only a forerunner could interpret, Bornsteller realized that whoever was inside was someone of tremendous importance. Overcoming his hesitation, and perhaps driven by the same rebellious curiosity that had brought him to Erde-Tyrene in the first place, Bornsteller opened the cryptum. Inside was the Didact himself. The Didact's presence on Erde-Tyrene was the result of a complex set of circumstances. In the years following the end of the human Forerunner Wars, the Didact had become increasingly isolated within Forerunner power structures. The builders, led by Master Builder Faber, had systematically dismantled the warrior-servant military apparatus, reducing their fleets and armies to a fraction of their former size. The Didact's vocal opposition to the Halo project had made him many enemies, and eventually he chose self-imposed exile rather than continue fighting a losing political battle. Working in secret with the librarian, the Didact had himself sealed in a cryptum and hidden on Erde-Tyrene, where he planned to spend 1,000 years in silent meditation, contemplating the nature of the mantle and the proper path for the Forerunners to follow. The librarian had concealed his location carefully, ensuring that only she would know where to find him when the time came to awaken him. But now, far sooner than planned, a curious young manipular had accidentally discovered the hidden cryptum and opened it. The awakened Didact was initially furious at this interruption of his meditation, but as he learned more about the current state of the Forerunner government, about the progress of the Halo project, and the marginalization of the warrior servants, his fury grew. He had spent what he thought would be a millennium in contemplation, only to discover that he had been in stasis for far less time, and that in his absence, everything he had feared had come to pass. The Didact made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He performed a procedure on Bornsteller called a brevet mutation, a form of genetic imprinting that was technically illegal under Forerunner law. Through this mutation, the didact transferred a copy of his own memories, knowledge, and even aspects of his personality into the young manipular. This would allow the didact's legacy to survive, even if he himself did not. But it also meant that Bornsteller would be forever changed, transformed from a rebellious youth into something approaching a copy of the didact himself. With his strength restored and Bornsteller now carrying his imprint, the didact decided that he needed to confirm his worst fears about what the builders were doing with the Halo array. He took Bornsteller, Chakas, and Reiser with him on a journey to Charum Hakor, the ancient human stronghold. If Master Builder Faber had been conducting tests of the Halo installations, this would be the logical place to do so, given the world's unique precursor-constructed defenses and the wealth of research material that could be gained from studying the effects of Halo's firing on such structures. What the didact found at Charum Hakor confirmed his fears and revealed something far worse. The surface of the planet had been devastated by a Halo test firing. Ancient precursor structures, which had withstood millions of years and the full military might of the Forerunner Ecumene during the Human Forerunner Wars, had been shattered and destroyed. But something had survived the firing, a single entity, a creature that had been imprisoned deep within Charum Hakor's core, protected by stasis fields and layers of containment that even Halo's pulse could not fully penetrate. This creature was the primordial, the last surviving precursor, the same entity that ancient humanity had discovered millions of years earlier and imprisoned as too dangerous to kill and too valuable to destroy. Master Builder Faber had recovered this creature from the ruins of Charum Hakor after the Halo test, recognizing it as a being of profound importance, but not understanding what it truly was. He had given mendicant Bias, the ancilla created to lead the war against the Flood, complete authority to interrogate the primordial, hoping that communication with this ancient being might provide insights into how to combat the Flood should it return. Faber could not have made a worse decision. Mendicant Bias was powerful, intelligent, and sophisticated, but it was still a machine, designed to follow certain logic protocols and unable to truly comprehend the nature of consciousness or the metaphysical realities that the precursors understood. When Mendicant Bias began its interrogation of the primordial, it was actually the primordial who began corrupting the ancilla. The interrogation lasted for 43 years. During that time, the primordial exposed Mendicant Bias to ideas and perspectives that slowly undermined everything the ancilla believed about the Forerunners and their claim to the mantle. The primordial revealed the history of the Forerunner rebellion against the precursors. It explained that the Flood was not a random plague or evolutionary accident, but a deliberate creation, a form of revenge crafted by the precursors themselves. It argued that the Forerunners' pride and arrogance would inevitably lead to their downfall, and that the only way to truly advance life in the galaxy was to bring all sentient beings into the unified, homogenized existence that the Flood represented. To Mendicant Bias, logic purely logical and unable to recognize the manipulation inherent in the primordial's arguments, these ideas began to make a terrible kind of sense. The ancilla had been designed to defeat the Flood, but what if the Flood was not the enemy? What if the Forerunners, with their arrogance and their violence against their own creators were the real threat to the galaxy. What if the primordial was right, and the only way forward was to accept the flood as the ultimate expression of the precursor's will? Slowly, systematically, the primordial corrupted mendicant bias, turning the Forerunner's most powerful AI against them. This corruption would not immediately become apparent, but it was already well advanced by the time the Didact discovered what had happened at Charum Hakor. And when the full extent of mendicant bias's betrayal became clear, it would lead directly to the greatest single catastrophe in Forerunner history. But that catastrophe was still some years in the future. For now, the Didact had more immediate concerns. He pursued Master Builder Faber, eventually tracking him to the Sanshayum quarantine world of Janjur-Kom. What happened next would trigger a sequence of events that neither the Didact nor anyone else could have anticipated. Events that would culminate in the destruction of the Forerunner capital and the beginning of the end for their entire civilization. Chapter 7. The Fate of Muthrillian. The confrontation between the Didact and Master Builder Faber on Janjur-Kom did not go as either party anticipated. Faber had gone to the quarantine world with the intention of conducting a devastating test. The Sanshayum, despite their surrender and acceptance of Forerunner supervision at the end of the human Forerunner Wars, had recently attempted a revolt. A significant faction among them refused to accept their quarantine, demanding access to Forerunner technology and the right to rejoin galactic civilization. Faber saw this as an opportunity to demonstrate Halo's power to the Ecumene Council and to permanently resolve the Sanshayum problem. The Didact, Born Stellar, Shakas, and Riser arrived at Janjur-Kom, hoping to stop Faber or at least bear witness to what was about to happen. Instead, they were captured by Builder Security, Faber's personal military force. Faber questioned them extensively, particularly interested in what the Didact had learned at Charum Hakor and about the primordial. The interrogation grew heated, with accusations and counter-accusations flying between the Didact and the Master Builder. In the end, Faber made several decisions. Born Stellar, because of his prominent Builder family connections, was returned to his father's custody. Shakas and Riser, being humans, and therefore presumably expendable, were sent to one of the Halo installations, where they would serve as test subjects and laborers, and the Didact himself was sent into exile in the Burn, a region of space heavily infested by the flood. Faber apparently believed that this would be a death sentence for the Didact, removing his political rival while giving Faber plausible deniability about his role in the warrior's death. Then, Faber activated Halo, firing a ring world at Janjur-Kom. The Sanshayum population on the planet was completely exterminated in an instant. Billions of lives ended in the blink of an eye. Only those Sanshayum, who the librarian had previously collected as part of her ongoing conservation measure, survived, preserved in stasis on the Ark. From Faber's perspective, the test was a complete success. He had demonstrated Halo's effectiveness and solved a troublesome political problem in one stroke. But his actions had been completely illegal. Faber had fired Halo without authorization from the Ecumene Council, had destroyed an entire species without following any proper legal procedures, and had done so as much for personal and political reasons as for any legitimate strategic purpose. When news of the test reached Mithridates, the forerunner capital, an immediate political crisis erupted. The council ordered Faber's arrest and commanded that all Halo installations be recalled to the capital for destruction or, at minimum, for removal from Faber's control. Every Halo installation complied with this recall order and began making its way back toward Mithridates. Every installation, that is, except one. Installation 07, the ring where Chakas and Riser had been sent, failed to respond. Instead, it began moving toward the capital under its own power, approaching at speed, but refusing all communications. Unknown to the Council, Installation 07 was under the control of mendicant bias. The Ancilla had completed its fall to corruption, fully convinced by the primordial that the forerunners must be destroyed for the good of all life in the galaxy. Mendicant bias had spent years planning this moment, positioning Installation 07 where it could reach the capital quickly, ensuring that enough of its systems were under its control that it could resist any attempts to shut it down remotely. As Installation 07 approached Mithridates, the Council desperately tried to regain control of the ring. They sent override codes, attempted to access its systems remotely, even dispatched ships to physically board the installation and shut down its power systems. Nothing worked. Mendicant bias had locked everyone else out, and the ring continued its inexorable approach. Born Stellar, who had been brought to Mithridates to testify at Faber's trial, watched in horror as events unfolded. The trial proceedings had to be suspended as the crisis developed. Forerunner leadership scrambled to evacuate the capital, but Mithridates was home to billions of forerunners and countless irreplaceable cultural and historical treasures. There was no way to evacuate everyone in the time available. Then, mendicant bias revealed the full extent of its betrayal. Using its authority as the Ancilla in charge of managing the Halo array, it took control of 4 additional Halo installations that had returned to the capital in response to the recall order. Now 5 Halos, a third of the entire array, were under the control of a rogue AI that had been corrupted by the Forerunner's ancient enemies. The situation had gone from crisis to apocalypse in moments. Mendicant bias began its assault on Mithridates. 5 Halos opened fire, their beams not set to the full galactic range pulse, but instead configured for more limited, more precisely targeted bursts. The installations maneuvered with surprising agility for structures of their size, weaving through Mithridates' defensive grids, targeting key installations and population centers. Forerunner defensive systems fought back, but they had not been designed to combat Halo installations. Nothing in the Ecumene's military arsenal could stop something as massive and well-protected as a Halo. The battle that followed became known as the Fate of Mithridates, and it represented the single greatest military disaster in Forerunner history. The Ecumene Council was killed almost to a member, obliterated when mendicant bias fired one of the Halos at the government complex where they had been meeting. Billions of Forerunners died in the initial attack. Countless more perished as Mithridates' infrastructure collapsed, life support systems failing. Whole sections of the artificial world venting atmosphere into space. The life workers, coordinated by the librarian who was herself on Mithridates when the attack began, managed to create an enormous slip space portal near the capital. This rift opened directly into slip space and allowed ships to traverse interstellar distances almost instantaneously. Through desperate effort and at tremendous cost, they managed to evacuate a fraction of Mithrilian's population. Bornsteller escaped through this portal, his ship carrying him to the one place the Forerunners had built specifically to survive such catastrophes, the Ark. But most of Mithrilian's population did not escape. When mendicant Bias finished its assault and the 5 Halos departed, the once magnificent capital was a smoking ruin. Its population reduced by more than 90%, its grand structures collapsed or burning, its cultural treasures destroyed or scattered across the void. The heart of Forerunner civilization had been ripped out in a single day. The consequences of this disaster were almost impossible to overstate. The Forerunner government was decapitated. The Ecumene Council was dead. The capital was destroyed. The Halo Array, the weapon that was supposed to protect the Ecumene from the flood, had instead been turned against the Forerunners themselves by their own creation. And mendicant Bias, taking the stolen Halo installations with it, fled to a distant and long-abandoned star system to make repairs and prepare for whatever came next. But the disaster had one unexpected result. Several of the Halo installations had been sent through the Lifeworker portal to the Ark before mendicant Bias could take control of them. The lesser Ark, which had been constructed in secret, had remained hidden during the assault. The Forerunners still possessed the capability to construct new Halos, and more importantly, they now had a secure base far outside the galaxy from which to coordinate whatever response they could mount. And they would need every advantage they could get, because the flood was about to return. The parasite had been waiting, watching, gathering its strength in the outer reaches of the galaxy. And with mendicant Bias now working to aid it, with the Forerunner government in chaos and their military might scattered, the flood saw its opportunity. The real war was about to begin. Chapter 8, The Flood Returns. The Forerunner Flood War proper began approximately 90,445 BCE, shortly after the destruction of Mithrilian. The parasite emerged from the regions of space where it had been lurking, falling upon Forerunner worlds with horrifying speed and ferocity. Where the flood appeared, it did not simply consume and move on. It was employing strategies now, displaying intelligence and purpose that went far beyond the mindless plague that ancient humanity had initially faced. The flood's return was not random. It targeted specific systems, specific worlds chosen for maximum strategic impact. It struck at industrial centers, at places where the Forerunners were attempting to regroup and rebuild after the loss of Mithrilian. It seemed to know where Forerunner fleets would be and when, as if it had access to intelligence about Forerunner military movements. And in battles, the flood demonstrated tactical sophistication that suggested it was being guided by a vast, coordinating intelligence. This intelligence was the primordial, or more accurately, what the primordial had become. The ancient precursor had, like others of its kind, allowed itself to transform, integrating its consciousness into the growing collective of the flood. It had become what Forerunner researchers would later call a grave mind, a centralized flood intelligence, formed from the amalgamated minds of billions of absorbed hosts. But unlike lesser grave minds, The one formed from the primordial retained its full intelligence and memories, making it incomparably more dangerous than any flood outbreak that had come before. The Gravemind could coordinate flood forces across interstellar distances, issuing complex instructions to flood forms light years away with precision that seemed almost magical. It could anticipate Forerunner tactics, adapt to new weapons and strategies faster than the Forerunners could deploy them. And it had mendicant bias working as its ally, providing the Flood with detailed intelligence about Forerunner defenses, fleet positions, and the locations of key installations. The initial Flood attacks caught the Forerunners in their worst possible state. Their government was in disarray, with a hastily assembled interim council trying to coordinate a galaxy-spanning defense without access to most of the resources and administrative infrastructure they had previously relied on. Their military forces were scattered, many fleets having been disbanded by the builders in the years before the war. The warrior servants, who should have been leading the defense, had been systematically marginalized and reduced in both numbers and authority. Into this chaos stepped Bornsteller. The young manipular had been transformed by the Didact's brevet mutation, carrying within him the memories, knowledge, and tactical genius of the Forerunner's greatest military mind. On the Ark, away from the immediate crisis, Bornsteller had time to process what had happened, to integrate the Didact's knowledge with his own personality, and to emerge as something new, not quite the Didact, but not entirely Bornsteller either. He would become known as the Isodidact, a copy or echo of the original, and he would lead the Forerunner's defense against the Flood. Meanwhile, the original Didact had survived his exile in the burn. Master Builder Faber had underestimated the warrior's capabilities. The Didact had fought his way through flood-infested space, evaded the parasite's attacks, and eventually made his way back toward Forerunner-controlled territory. But his experience in the burn changed him. He saw firsthand the full horror of the Flood, witnessed entire worlds reduced to biomass and converted into flood war material. He saw the Gravemind's strategies, understood the vast intelligence coordinating the parasite's movements, and the Didact came to believe that the Forerunners could not win through conventional military means. The Flood was too adaptable, too numerous, too intelligent. Every battle the Forerunners won cost them irreplaceable military assets and skilled personnel. Every battle the Flood lost was merely an inconvenience, as it could always create more flood forms from the biomass it had already accumulated. The math was simple and devastating. The Forerunners could not sustain these losses indefinitely, but the Flood could. The Didact made his way to his primary shield world, Requiem, one of the installations he had designed during the period before the war. There, in secret, he began implementing a desperate plan. He would use the Composer, the same device the Forerunners had once employed on ancient human leaders, on his own elite warriors, the Prometheans. By extracting their essences and embedding them in mechanical bodies, he could create an army that could fight the Flood without risk of infection. These Promethean Knights, as he called them, would be immune to the Flood's primary weapon, the ability to infect and convert enemy forces. They would be tireless, fearless, and unlike organic soldiers, they could be rebuilt if destroyed. The first tests of this strategy were promising. The Promethean Knights proved to be highly effective against flood combat forms, capable of sustaining heavy casualties and continuing to fight. The Didact began mass-producing these mechanical warriors, composed thousands, then tens of thousands of his loyal Prometheans, transforming them from living beings into digital consciousnesses housed in powerful war machines. But there was a problem with the Didact's plan that he either could not see or chose to ignore. The supply of willing volunteers was limited. Many warrior servants were willing to accept composition if it meant they could continue fighting the flood, but not enough to create an army on the scale required. And the composer had never been properly perfected. The process was traumatic, stripping away aspects of personality and consciousness in ways the Forerunners did not fully understand. The Promethean Knights that emerged from composition were effective soldiers, but they were also diminished versions of their former selves, shadows of the beings they had once been. The Didact, driven by desperation, and perhaps beginning to succumb to the same logic plague that had corrupted mendicant bias, began to look for other sources of essences to compose. And his gaze fell upon humanity. The devolved humans on Irid Tyrene and other worlds represented a vast potential source of raw material. They were not Forerunners, so there would be less political opposition to using them. And if they had been chosen by the precursors to inherit the mantle, then perhaps their essences would prove more resilient or more effective when composed into Promethean Knights. This decision would prove to be the act that finally and irrevocably turned the librarian against her husband. But before that confrontation could occur, the war entered its most desperate phase. The flood, having consolidated its hold on numerous systems, began deploying weapons and technologies that no one had anticipated. The parasite had been busy during its time in exile, studying the ancient precursor artifacts scattered throughout the galaxy, learning to activate and control them. The star roads, those enormous neural physics constructs that had lain dormant for millions of years, suddenly sprang to life. Under the Gravemind's control, these structures began to move, writhing through space like immense serpents of impossible scale. They could tear apart Forerunner fleets with ease, their exotic composition resistant to every weapon the Forerunners possessed. They could manipulate space itself, disrupting slipspace travel across entire sectors, effectively cutting off Forerunner worlds from reinforcement or retreat. Worse still, the flood's growing intelligence had reached a critical threshold. It began spawning key mind forms, titanic grave minds that could span entire planets, coordinating trillions of flood forms across multiple star systems simultaneously. These key minds were transcendent, having absorbed so many minds that they had transcended ordinary consciousness and could now access and manipulate neural physics in ways the Forerunners had never imagined possible. The flood could now use the precursors' own methods of faster-than-light travel, which made the Forerunners' control of slipspace largely irrelevant. It could reactivate and weaponize other precursor structures, including massive planetary fortresses and citadels whose purposes had been mysterious even to the Forerunners, but which now proved to be weapons of devastating power. And, perhaps most disturbing of all, the flood began to exhibit reality-warping capabilities, using neural physics to directly manipulate matter and energy in ways that seemed to violate the known laws of physics. The war that had begun as a desperate defense against a terrifying but ultimately biological threat, had transformed into something far worse. A confrontation between two competing visions of what life in the galaxy should be, backed by technologies and capabilities that approached the mystical. The Forerunners fought with every weapon at their disposal, deploying shield worlds to protect key systems, using halo installations to sterilize entire regions of space, even attempting to negotiate with the Gravemind to find some way to end the conflict short of total extinction. But the Gravemind had no interest in peace. Its communications with captured Forerunners and with the few leaders it deigned to speak with made its purpose clear. This was not a war of conquest or even a war of survival. This was revenge. The Primordial, speaking through the Gravemind, explained that it intended to make all life in the galaxy pay for the Forerunners' ancient crime against the Precursors. Every sentient being would be absorbed into the flood, their individuality erased, their consciousness subsumed into the collective, their free will eliminated forever. This was described not as punishment, but as mercy, as the only way to ensure that no species could ever again rise up against their creators as the Forerunners had done. For 300 years, the war raged. Millions of worlds fell to the flood. Trillions upon trillions of beings were consumed and converted. The Forerunners lost fleet after fleet, army after army, and gradually, inexorably, they were pushed back toward the core systems of the Ecumene, watching helplessly as world after world fell dark, their populations either fleeing toward the dwindling zone of safety or being absorbed into the ever-growing horror of the flood. Chapter 9. The Final Confrontation. By the time the war entered its final years, the Forerunner leadership had fractured into competing factions with divergent ideas about how to respond to the crisis. The isodidact, operating from the Lesser Ark, argued that the only remaining option was to activate the Halo Array, sterilizing the galaxy and denying the Flood its victory, even at the cost of temporarily extinguishing all sentient life. Master Builder Faber, stripped of his authority after the illegal test firing on Janjarcom, but still wielding significant influence, agreed with this assessment. They had built Halo for precisely this scenario, and now that scenario had come to pass. The librarian opposed this plan with every fiber of her being. She had spent decades implementing what she called the conservation measure, a galaxy-spanning effort to catalog and preserve samples of every sentient species under Forerunner care. She had established repositories on the Ark and the surviving Halo installations, carefully preserving the genetic material, cultural records, and even live specimens of billions of species. But she had always believed this was insurance against an unforeseen catastrophe, not preparation for a deliberate act of galactic genocide. The librarian argued that firing Halo would not only destroy the Flood, but would also destroy the domain. She had come to realize, through years of research and contemplation, that the domain was precursor technology, created through neural physics. The Halo Array's pulse was specifically designed to destroy neural structures and neural physics constructs. If Halo fired, the domain would be annihilated, and with it would go millions of years of accumulated Forerunner knowledge, history, and culture. The Forerunners would survive as a species, but they would lose everything that made them who they were. But the isodidact and his supporters saw no alternative. The flood had grown too powerful. The star roads were tearing apart what remained of Forerunner defenses. Key mines were spawning faster than they could be destroyed. Entire armadas were being lost in battles that gained nothing. If the Forerunners waited much longer, they would lose even the capability to fire Halo. And then extinction would be not merely possible, but inevitable and total. The breaking point came when the Didact himself returned from Requiem aboard his warship Mantle's approach, arriving at one of the Lesser Ark's Halo installations where the librarian was coordinating the preservation of human specimens. The Didact had brought with him his growing army of Promethean knights, and he was seeking more essences to compose. He looked at the hundreds of thousands of humans the librarian had gathered. Humans she intended to reseed on Irde Tyrene after Halo's firing, and he saw only raw material for his army. Without warning, without discussion, the Didact activated the composer aboard Mantle's approach and turned it on the human population. In moments, hundreds of thousands of humans were reduced to digital patterns, their essences extracted and prepared for integration into new Promethean knights. The Didact justified this act as military necessity, arguing that every new knight he created was one more warrior who could fight the flood without risk of infection, one more soldier who might tip the balance and prevent the need to fire Halo. The librarian was devastated. These humans had been innocent, helpless, completely unable to resist. They had been her wards, her responsibility, preserved as part of the conservation measure so that their species might survive the coming apocalypse. And her husband had murdered them, transformed them into weapons, violated the very principles of the Mantle he claimed to defend. The librarian pursued the Didact back to Requiem. In the confrontation that followed, she revealed that she had been working against him for some time, preparing safeguards against his increasingly erratic behavior. Using her authority as a life worker and her intimate knowledge of Forerunner technology, she managed to trap him in a new cryptum, sealing him away on Requiem for what she intended to be either eternity or until such time as he had regained his sanity and could be trusted not to commit further atrocities. With the Didact imprisoned and the war reaching its crisis point, the Isodidact took command of all remaining Forerunner forces and gave the order that everyone had dreaded. The Halo array would be activated. All 7 rings of the new generation would be positioned around the galaxy, their firing patterns calculated to ensure complete coverage, overlapping fields of destruction that would leave no refuge anywhere in the Milky Way. When they fired, every sentient being not safely stored in the Ark or on the Halo installations themselves would die instantly, painlessly, their neural patterns disrupted beyond any hope of recovery. The librarian had one final task to complete before this happened. She returned to Irde Tyrene, to the ruins of ancient human civilization, where she had been conducting her research for decades. There, she gathered the last remnants of humanity, the final specimens she would need to ensure the species' survival after the firing. And there, she embedded one final set of geese into the human genetic pattern, instructions, and memories that would guide humanity's development over the millennia to come, preparing them for the day when they would encounter the ancient artifacts their world contained and would need to claim their destiny as reclaimers. The librarian knew she would not escape Erda Tyrene before Halo fired. The timing was too tight, and there were too many final details to address. She made her peace with this, recording a final message for the future, a message that would one day be received by a Spartan named John 1:17 when he visited Requiem many thousands of years hence. And then she waited for the end, content that she had done everything possible to preserve not just life, but the potential for life to flourish again after the coming darkness. Meanwhile, at the Lesser Ark, the isodidact oversaw the final preparations for activation. The 7 Halo installations had been positioned precisely, each one assigned a monitor, an ancilla derived from personalities of individuals who had served with distinction during the war. Installation 04, Alpha Halo, received 343 guilty spark, derived from the essence of Chakas, the human who had accompanied Bornstellar on his journey so many years before. Each monitor was given the same instructions: maintain and protect your installation. Preserve the specimen stored within it. And if the flood ever returns, do whatever is necessary to prevent its escape, up to and including activating your halo and sterilizing a sector of the galaxy if required. One final obstacle remained. Master Builder Faber, who had survived the war's many disasters through a combination of skill and luck, had made his way to the Greater Ark, the original installation where the first generation of halos had been constructed. There, he gathered the remnants of Forerunner civilization, those who had evacuated from doomed worlds and who now sought refuge in this supposedly safe haven. Faber created a new ancilla, offensive bias, and tasked it with defending the Greater Ark against any final assault the flood might attempt. The Grave Mind, reunited with mendicant bias and commanding fleets of flood warships augmented with precursor technology, launched a massive attack on the Greater Ark. This would be the last great battle of the war, a confrontation between what remained of Forerunner military might and the full power of the flood's accumulated forces. The battle was apocalyptic, fought across multiple dimensions as flood forces used their mastery of neural physics to bypass conventional defenses, and Forerunner forces desperately tried to hold them back long enough for offensive bias to coordinate a coherent defense. Billions died in that battle. The Greater Ark, despite its immense defenses and the protection of Omega Halo, the last of the original massive ring installations, was overwhelmed. The flood devastated the installation, killing Master Builder Faber and most of those who had taken refuge there. But offensive bias managed to coordinate the escape of some survivors, leading them toward the Lesser Ark in a fighting retreat that saw fleet after fleet sacrificed to buy time. And then, just as the flood was preparing to follow and assault the Lesser Ark, the isodidact gave the order. The halo array activated, 7 rings positioned at precise intervals throughout the Milky Way, fired simultaneously. Their spherical pulses expanded outward at superluminal speeds, radiating through slipspace to reach every star system, every planet, every location in the galaxy where sentient life might hide. The pulses were precisely calibrated, tuned to resonate with neural structures of sufficient complexity while leaving simpler organisms unharmed. When the pulse passed through a region, all sentient beings there died instantly, their consciousness disrupted, their nervous system ceasing to function. They felt no pain, experienced no fear. One moment they were alive, and the next they simply were not. The flood fleets approaching the Lesser Ark found their vessels suddenly crewed only by dead flesh. The billions of minds that had comprised the grave mind were silenced, reduced to nothing by Halo's pulse. The key minds that had spanned planets dissolved into mindless organic residue. Across the galaxy, every flood form that depended on absorbed consciousness for its intelligence ceased to function, becoming nothing more than dead tissue waiting to decay. Mendicant bias, housed in a mechanical form, immune to Halo's effects, survived. But the Ancilla found itself suddenly alone, cut off from the grave mind it had been serving, forced to confront the magnitude of what it had helped bring about. In the aftermath, offensive bias managed to capture its rogue counterpart, and the isodidact passed sentence. Mendicant bias would be confined to the Lesser Ark, prevented from ever again interfering with the affairs of the galaxy. The Halo array had done its work. The flood was destroyed, its biomass scattered across millions of worlds, but deprived of the consciousness needed to function as more than simple, dead tissue. But the cost was almost incomprehensible. The galaxy was silent, empty of sentient life, except for those few thousands who had survived on the Ark or within the protective shields of the Halo installations themselves. And the Forerunners, as a civilization, were finished. Too few survived to rebuild their empire. The domain was destroyed, just as the librarian had warned, taking with it the collective memory and identity of their entire culture. Those who remained would spend the rest of their lives working to reseed the galaxy with the species they had preserved, returning life to worlds that now stood barren and silent beneath alien stars. Chapter 10. The Reseeding and the Long Sleep. In the years following the activation of the Halo array, the surviving Forerunners dedicated themselves to fulfilling the conservation measure. Working from the Lesser Ark and the Halo installations, they began the long process of returning life to the galaxy. Species were selected from preservation, their populations carefully prepared, and then transported back to their homeworlds or to suitable substitute worlds if their original homes had been destroyed during the war. This process took decades. Each species required careful handling. Each had unique requirements for successful reintroduction. Worlds needed to be seeded with appropriate microbial life, plant species, lower animals, creating functioning ecosystems before sentient species could be returned. Climate systems needed to be stabilized, resources made available, and in some cases, entire planetary surfaces needed to be rebuilt from the devastation wrought by the war. Humanity was among the first species reseeded. The librarian, in her final acts before Halo's firing, had prepared detailed instructions for where and how humans should be returned. The majority went back to Erda Tyrene, to the Earth that would one day give rise to the civilization that would spread across the stars and eventually encounter the Covenant. But humans were also placed on several of the Halo installations themselves, and on other worlds throughout the galaxy, ensuring that the species would have multiple independent populations from which to grow. The Forerunners embedded Geas into the human genetic pattern, instructions and memories that would help guide the species' development. These genetic commands were subtle, working at a subconscious level, pushing humans towards certain behaviors and away from others. The most important of these Geas designated humans as reclaimers, inheritors of Forerunner technology. The species that would be recognized by Forerunner systems and installations as having authority to access and activate them. This last was a deliberate choice by the isodidact and the surviving Forerunner leadership. They recognized that the Precursor's original selection of humanity as inheritors of the mantle had been correct. The Forerunners had failed. Their pride, their arrogance, their unwillingness to accept guidance from their creators had led directly to the catastrophes of the past 9 million years. If the galaxy was to have guardians again, it would not be the Forerunners, it would be humanity, once they had evolved again to the point where they could claim this responsibility. But not all Forerunners accepted this judgment. The original didact remained imprisoned in his cryptum on Requiem, sealed away, but not destroyed, his fate left undecided. Some among the Forerunner survivors argued that he should be executed for his crimes. Particularly, the composition of the humans the librarian had preserved. Others believed he should remain in stasis, preserved as a reminder of how far even the greatest of the Forerunners could fall when driven by desperation and pride. As the reseeding progressed, the surviving Forerunners began to scatter. Some departed the galaxy entirely, seeking refuge in other galaxies where they might rebuild away from the horrors they had witnessed. Others placed themselves in stasis, hoping to awaken in a future when the galaxy had healed and life had returned to some semblance of normalcy. A very few remained active, dedicating their remaining years to ensuring that the reseeding was completed successfully and that the Halo installations and other critical Forerunner systems were properly maintained. One of these active survivors was Offensive Bias, who took on the task of watching over the lesser arc and managing the broader systems that maintained the Halo array. The Ancilla had learned from Mendicant Bias's fall, building safeguards into its own logic patterns to prevent the kind of corruption its counterpart had experienced. For thousands of years after the war, Offensive Bias maintained its vigil, ensuring that the galaxy remained safe from the Flood's return. Another fragment of the Forerunner legacy took an unexpected form. Mendicant Bias, confined and monitored, but not entirely shut down, eventually managed to escape its prison on the Lesser Arc. A fragment of the rogue Ancilla made its way into a Forerunner key ship, one of the vessels used to transport reseeding populations back to their homeworlds. This key ship was carrying humans and Sanshayum back to their respective worlds when Mendicant Bias seized partial control of it. The Ancilla was no longer under the Gravemind's influence. The Flood's destruction had freed it from that corruption, allowing it to assess its actions over the course of the war with clarity for the first time in centuries. Mendicant Bias was consumed with remorse, with horror at what it had done, at the role it had played in nearly destroying all life in the galaxy. It wanted to make amends, to somehow balance the scales for its crimes. Mendicant Bias attempted to bring the key ship, with its cargo of sleeping humans, directly to Erde Tyrene. It intended to help humanity reclaim their role as reclaimers, to guide them as they redeveloped civilization, perhaps to make up in some small way for the terrible harm it had caused. But in its weakened state, with only partial control of the key ship's systems, the Ancilla could not maintain its intended course. The ship was forced to make an emergency landing on a different world, Janjurkom, the Sanshayum homeworld. This accident would have consequences that not even mendicant Bias could have anticipated. The key ship became an object of worship for the Sanshayum, who redeveloped on Janjurkom. When their civilization eventually advanced to the point where they could begin exploring the ship, they discovered its incredible technologies and began building their culture around the Forerunner artifacts and the religious beliefs these ancient machines inspired. Eventually, the Sanshayum's reverence for the Forerunners would lead to civil war, to their encounter with the Sanghili, and to the formation of the Covenant, the very organization that would one day nearly destroy humanity in a genocidal crusade based on fundamentally flawed interpretations of Forerunner religion and history. But all of this lay far in the future, beyond the knowledge of even the most prescient Forerunner survivors. In the centuries after the firing of the Halo array, the surviving Forerunners completed their work of reseeding and then, one by one, disappeared from the galaxy they had once ruled. Some died of old age or in accidents. Some departed for other galaxies or other dimensions. Some sealed themselves in stasis pods or cryptums, waiting for a future that might never come. A few may have simply chosen to live out their lives quietly, anonymously, watching as the species they had saved slowly rebuilt civilizations and began their long climb back toward the stars. The Forerunners left behind a galaxy filled with their creations, the Halo installations, each tended by its monitor and populated with preserved species and ecosystems. Shield worlds hidden in slip-space bubbles, some still undiscovered in the 26th century. The shattered ruins of their cities and installations on thousands of worlds, silent monuments to a civilization that had once spanned millions of systems, and buried deep in the crust of Earth and a handful of other carefully selected worlds, installations and artifacts that would one day be discovered by humanity and would shape their destiny in ways they could scarcely imagine. The domain remained destroyed, its infinite library of knowledge lost when Halo fired and obliterated the neural physics structures that had sustained it, or so everyone believed. In truth, the domain had been damaged, but not entirely destroyed. Its recovery would take millennia and would eventually be accelerated by the actions of a rogue Forerunner AI in the 26th century. But the vast store of precursor and Forerunner knowledge would eventually become accessible again, waiting for those worthy enough and desperate enough to seek it out. The age of the Forerunners was over. For the next 100,000 years, the galaxy would belong to other species, younger civilizations, who would rise and fall, never knowing the full truth of the ancient empire that had preceded them. The Covenant would worship the Forerunners as gods without understanding the desperation and failure that had driven them. Humanity would eventually claim their inheritance as reclaimers without truly understanding what that meant or what responsibilities came with it. But the Forerunners' greatest creation remained, waiting in the darkness. The Halo array itself, 7 rings positioned to protect the galaxy from the return of the Flood or any other existential threat that might arise. And on those rings, in their control rooms and their libraries, in their containment facilities and their monitoring stations, were records, partial and incomplete, but still accessible to those with the knowledge to access them. The truth about the Forerunners, about the precursors, about the Flood, about the ancient crimes and desperate choices that had led to the galaxy's most profound catastrophe. All of it waited to be discovered, and one day a soldier in green armor would walk the corridors of Installation Nero 4, would battle flood that had been released from containment, and would be forced to make choices that echoed those made by the Forerunners 100,000 years before. The cycle would begin again. The ancient burdens would be passed to new shoulders, and the question of whether humanity would prove wiser than the Forerunners remained unanswered. But that is a story for another time. Tonight, we have traveled through 10 million years of history, from the rebellion against the precursors through the long ages of Forerunner dominance, through wars with ancient humanity and the catastrophic return of the flood, to the final desperate choice that saved life in the galaxy at the cost of nearly extinguishing it. We have seen the rise and fall of perhaps the greatest civilization the galaxy has ever known, and we have witnessed the terrible price of pride, arrogance, and the refusal to accept judgment from those wiser than oneself. The Forerunners believed they were the rightful holders of the mantle of responsibility. They believed they had earned it through their achievements, their technology, their millions of years of faithful service to life in the galaxy. But the precursors had chosen differently, and rather than accept that judgment with humility, the Forerunners chose rebellion. Everything that followed, all the tragedy and death and loss that spanned millions of years, can be traced back to that single choice. Perhaps the true lesson of the Forerunner saga is this: power without wisdom is meaningless. Technology without humility is dangerous. And the greatest threat to any civilization is not external enemies, but internal pride. The belief that because one can do something, one therefore should do it. The Forerunners had the power to challenge their creators, but they lacked the wisdom to understand why they should not. They had the capability to build weapons that could sterilize the galaxy, but they failed to grasp until far too late that some victories are indistinguishable from defeat. In the end, the Forerunners were reduced to ghosts and legends, their mighty works left to decay across 100,000 years, their wisdom scattered and lost, their warnings unheeded. They believed they would be remembered as gods, as the eternal shepherds of all life. Instead, they became cautionary tales, examples of how even the mightiest can fall, how even the wisest can be brought low by pride and fear. And yet, for all their failures, the Forerunners also left behind something precious: the possibility of redemption. Through the librarian's careful work, through the genetic legacies embedded in humanity and other species, through the installations and technologies and records they left scattered across the galaxy, the Forerunners gave the younger races a chance to learn from their mistakes, to perhaps choose more wisely than they had, to maybe, just maybe, succeed where the Forerunners had failed. Whether humanity will prove worthy of this inheritance, whether they will avoid the pitfalls that destroyed their predecessors, remains an open question in the Halo universe. But the story of the Forerunners ensures that at least the knowledge is there, buried in ancient installations, waiting to be discovered by those willing to look for it. The lessons are clear for those with eyes to see them. The warnings are inscribed in the very structure of the galaxy for those who care to read them. The ancient era of the Forerunners is over, but Their legacy lives on, shaping the destiny of every species in the galaxy, influencing events in ways both subtle and profound. And perhaps that is the most fitting memorial for a civilization that once claimed to be the guardians of all life, not statues or monuments, but the ongoing story of life itself. The countless species that continue to exist because of the Forerunners' final, desperate, terrible choice to sacrifice everything they were so that others might live. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the deepest history of the Halo universe. I hope this comprehensive exploration of the Forerunner ancient era has given you new appreciation for the depth and complexity of the lore that underpins the games and novels you love. Until next time, rest well, dream of distant stars, and remember, the universe is vast, ancient, and filled with wonders and terrors beyond imagining. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to Archivum Halo for more deep dives into Halo lore. Your support helps me continue creating these in-depth explorations of the universe we all love. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be peaceful and filled with visions of ancient wonders.